It doesn't make sense to me to say that we want to pursue, say, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Right? I'm just picking utilitarianism as an idea. When you've already eliminated all the other groups of people that could be the majority.
I don't think there's a universal right to property, and therefore it can't apply to Indigenous communities either if it doesn't exist. The reason for that is that I hold a consequentialist ethic. That means actions are right or wrong depending on their consequences, and the particular version that I hold is utilitarianism, which says the consequences we should look at are the consequences for the well-being of all sentient creatures, all sentient beings affected by our actions. So consequentialist ethics are forward-looking. They're not backward-looking. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't think that anybody has a right to property. They may, because it may be that the system for improving the well-being of everybody is one that recognizes property rights. If we're considering land rights in the context of Indigenous people, and I'm very aware of this being an Australian, so it's not, I think, that there was an inherent right that was violated. Though, in Australia, because the Indigenous people were not settled, at one stage there was the view that it was terra nullius. So that is that there was no land ownership until the Europeans came there. And that was a justification for denying Indigenous people any land rights, which I think was clearly wrong. And fortunately, in a court decision in the 70s, that was rectified, and Indigenous people were recognised as some land ownership. But that land ownership was of Crown land and unsettled land, so it wasn't that all of the people living in Melbourne or Sydney, for example, suddenly lost their land ownership. And I think that would have been completely unrealistic and would not have had good consequences. But respecting the land rights of Indigenous people where we can, where they have a continuing connection to the land that they inhabited, and where it doesn't cause massive dislocation of lands that people have closely settled. I certainly think that's justified, but it's justified because Indigenous people are generally less well off than other people in Australia, and we can improve their well-being by recognising their close connection with land and allowing them to continue to have that connection. So it's a consequential basis that I would put forward, not a sort of fundamental rights basis.
In this conversation, I'm confused as to why the white settlers' view of what a boundary of property is becomes the basis by which they get to judge the Indigenous people's claim to whether or not they own the land. And this is the interpretive problem I think happens in philosophy, where we say, okay, we don't think they're universal rights, that these notions of rights are contingent and culturally situated, historically situated, but then the dominant rights that we have are recognized today in our time becomes the way that we evaluate these other principles. So because I'm trying to figure out what gives the European the right to the land. So if the European's not in the country, they're not on the land, they're not making use of it. And if there are people there that are making use of it, be it nomadic or settler, what then gives them the right to use force to claim the land unless it's unjust? Their initial property claim, if we're going with Lockean social contract theory, the initial Lockean claim of making use of the land through labor does not apply to the European because they're the settler. They have not made use of the land. So it's this kind of anachronism that creates the problem where we've situated the positionality of the Eurocentric legal system and the history that Europe's used to colonize and conduct imperial spheres of warfare and genocide as the basis for us measuring whether or not Indigenous people actually had an ownership claim. The reality of the situation is actually pretty simple, right? If the values are the principles that we're utilizing to say ownership exists within the European context, and we say, well, look, Indigenous people had a different value system where they understood relationally and historically that they were making use of the land and that they understood themselves to be reflected in that land. What is the argument the Europeans used to then convince them otherwise? And the answer to that is there was no argument. It was just brute force. You killed 95% of a population to claim that, hey, now we're the majority, we set up these laws, and then we'll distribute or rectify what we think Indigenous people who suffer these atrocities deserve based on the laws we set up after we killed them. Now, as a philosophy, right, as a philosopher, I'm motivated to think, what kind of ethics is that? And that doesn't come from the polemical side. It comes from a serious endeavor. If we say, as social contract theorists did, that we can look into the world and we can observe how we make agreements and arrangements and how we want to decide security and liberty and freedom, then what kind of world is reflected empirically in a contract that is started by genocide and elimination? And that's why I think these questions of ethics and morality need to be not only defined well, but understood well. It doesn't make sense to me to say that we want to pursue, say, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Right? I'm just picking utilitarianism as an idea. When you've already eliminated all the other groups of people that could be the majority. So let's say indigenous people outnumbered Europeans. I killed off 95% of them. Now I'm the greatest number of people, so I can make ethical deliberations. It's this process that formulates the basis of how we're having these debates today. And I think we need to be honest about that, because the intuition of a consequence, or the maximizing good, or even the idea of property rights and ownership, these were things that were contested and not afforded to everyone. And now we're saying, but if it's afforded to everyone, that should be the standard by which we make moral and ethical deliberations. And I think that part's dishonest.
I just need to say that utilitarians do not think that's the way to achieve the greatest number.
Fair enough. I somehow thought that was your view.
Whether the people are indigenous or not, they're going to have particular vested interests.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.